a warning about artificial intelligence. All that and more is coming up.
To have sex before you marry is a bad idea.
Don't tell me there's no such thing as gun violence.
That just depends on your definition of when life begins.
There are problems of sin and habit that cannot be solved outside the person of our Lord Jesus Christ.
Well, welcome to this week's episode of Faith versus Culture. I'm Trey Goins-Phillips here with our CBN News managing editor, Dan Andros. Dan, how are you today?
I'm doing great, Trey.
Well, it's good to have you here, and it's also good to have our guest, pastor and author, Russ Ramsey. Russ, you have a new book coming out called Van Gogh Has a Broken Heart. One, I want to ask you why you chose to write this book now, and then, and I know there are several artists throughout the book that you touch on, but tell us a little bit about Vincent van Gogh's history, because I'm curious, knowing that he grew up in a Christian home. He's the son of a minister.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have been fascinated by and drawn to the art of Vincent van Gogh since I was probably I was 13 or 14 years old and in art classes in middle school. And he's this painter. Everybody knows his work, but his life is one of those stories that's full of a lot of beauty and tragedy and struggle and suffering and being a person who was ahead of his time. He grew up around the church, in the church. He served for a while as a missionary in a mining town, a poor mining town in the Netherlands, and he had a very intimate and genuine relationship with Jesus and a very complicated relationship with the church, particularly the church in Europe in the mid to late 1800s. It was it became an institution that he didn't really want to be a part of, although his love for the Lord was something that he wrote about often in his letters. And so one of the things that just has always drawn me to his work is that there's an honesty that runs through it about the brokenness of the world that we live in, and it's even present in pictures that you would look at and think it's just a pot of sunflowers or it's a sky at night. But there's an ache, there's an undeniable ache in the way that he painted and in the way that he wrote that makes his work to me just representative of something that is trying to tell the truth. And the title actually comes from Van Gogh Has a Broken Heart, comes from a letter where he was describing a painting to his brother that he was painting of just a bridge crossing a river, but he was describing all the colors. And then at the end of it, he said, "I'm trying to get at something utterly heartbroken and therefore utterly heartbreaking." And that was kind of the way that he worked, is even if he's just painting a picture of a bridge at sunset, there's something in it where there's the ache and the plight of humankind that he was trying to get his mind around, his heart around, and his paintings to reflect.
So why were you drawn to even the topic of just art? I mean, right, as Christians, there's like a lot of big hot button issues going on. So talk about where art can speak into the big issues of the day today.
Well, art is one of those things that I think for many people, what drew me to writing about it and draws me to writing about it and speaking about it is that I think art is one of those subjects where a lot of people feel intimidation on the front end. If I don't have an art degree, if I haven't studied art appreciation, I'm going to feel a little lost if I try to engage. And for me, that's never been what's drawn me to art. I wasn't an art major in college. This is all just a passion project for me that I've devoted my life to. But it's art is storytelling, and we are people of stories. We are storytellers at heart, and we learn primarily by way of story and the human experience. It was Jesus' primary method of teaching, was to tell parables, these stories with a point. And art is, visual art in particular, is one of the formats of storytelling that has been recognized globally as one of the ways that we not only tell our stories, but tell our stories in a way that are preserved and passed down through time. And so to stand in an art museum, it's, every major city in the world has an art museum. Why is that? Because there's something about that collection of work, and the people then walking into that place to stand in front of it and to see it is not just that we're looking at pretty things, but we're looking at things that are telling our story back to us. And so the story element of the works of art themselves, and also the lives of the people who made these works of art, are fascinating to me. And so for me, these books really, at their most basic essence, is just stories. It's storytelling. And I love a good story, and I believe strongly in the power of a well-told story.
Yeah, absolutely. I 100% agree with you when it comes to storytelling and the way that resonates with us, unlike really anything else. Talk a little bit about the different artists that you went through in the book, and maybe anything that surprised you or caught you off guard, or you weren't expecting to learn about these different artists and their stories.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's surprising, although it shouldn't necessarily be a surprise, is that you know that old adage, be careful about meeting your heroes. A lot of the artists that are most celebrated, and frankly artists that Christians tend to revere as some of Christianity's finest storytellers through the medium of art, have very broken lives, and very complicated relationships with Christ and morality, and so for me, getting into the stories of these artists like Michelangelo, Rembrandt, Turner, Rockwell, they're these dynamic characters who their work is an expression of them trying to say something true, which is them trying to see something that's true. And I'm a person who believes that all truth is God's truth. And so whether the art is being made by somebody who professes the same faith as I do, is not the gate by which I determine whether I'm going to engage with their work, but it's are they trying to tell something true? Because a broken person who believes there is no God will tell us very, very true things about the loneliness of living in a broken world. Not because they're necessarily trying to make a hopeful comment about it, but they're trying to express what their experience is like. Edward Hopper is one of those painters that comes to mind with relationship to that. But yeah, so I find with all of these painters that their stories, the stories of their own lives and their own quest to try to make something that would be honest and would last, are stories that are very similar to the journey of a life of faith in this world, about which Jesus said, in this world you will have trouble. Take heart, I have overcome the world. But he doesn't say that in this world you'll just be surrounded by beauty and optimism. He says this is going to be a hard place to live. And a lot of the artists that I focus on have personally communicated something to me that has helped me navigate the difficulties I experience in this world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. Look, I think there's so much to discuss and so many things to go into, and we could go down so many different avenues with this. I'm excited to dig a little bit further into this conversation. So everybody stick with us. We'll be right back. We're going to fit in a quick break. We'll be right back on the other side. Well, welcome back to Faith versus Culture here on the CBN News Channel. We are joined by Russ Ramsey talking about his new book about art and the ways that we can communicate through art and the truths that can be communicated through art.
Yeah, and when you look back at art, obviously so much of it is got its root with Christian theology around it. So tell us about how it's influenced so many of the themes and styles of classic artists.
Yeah, art has always kind of relied on benefactors, people who will pay for it. And during the 1600s and 1700s, the biggest benefactors of art were churches, especially in Europe, where there wasn't a clear line between a church and a state. And so churches held a lot of cultural power. They held a lot of religious power, and they competed with each other. And so it was a place where there was a lot of wealth. There could be a lot of wealth, or at least discretionary spending. And then there were it was kind of a competition to get the best artists in their work in your church. And so, if you go to Italy, and you travel around there, you'll see, Michelangelo sculptures just hanging out in some church you've never heard of that's tucked away in some alley. But those churches would compete for having they were pop artists. They were rock stars in a lot of ways. And so there was a lot of intent, but also because it was churches, so much of the art that we have from those eras is religious and biblical in nature, because they were commissioned pieces. So Michelangelo is famous for the Sistine Chapel ceiling, painting basically the story of Scripture on the ceiling. But the only reason he did that was because he was hired by the Pope to do it. Like he hated that project. He was a person who thought that painting was way beneath his skill level, and described the Sistine Chapel process as a waste of his time, which is really funny because now you have to buy a ticket weeks in advance to go and and see it. But that's changed over time. I had this experience in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City, where I was on a floor where I was looking at Rembrandt and kind of Renaissance painters. And everybody in the gallery with me, we were looking around at paintings, and it was just silence. Nobody was saying anything. Hands behind our backs. It was reverent. And then I went down a flight of stairs and into a room that was Picasso and Dali and more modern art, and everybody was talking. And it was strange enough that I noticed, like, what is happening here? And I have a friend who's an artist, and I asked him, I said, what was going on with that? And he said, oh, you experienced the Enlightenment. And I said, well, what do you mean? And he said, well, there was a time when art was very declarative. The Renaissance painters, they were declaring things. They were telling you something. You were there to receive content from them. And then there was a cultural shift where art changed from being declarative to being more interrogative. Its purpose was to raise questions. And so what you were experiencing was the impact of art doing its work on you. When you're standing in front of these declarative pieces of work, it is as though they are saying, be quiet, pay attention, I'm telling you something. And then you get into this other gallery, and it's not doing that anymore. Now you're trying to figure out, what are you even looking at? And that's been a thing that has changed. It's changed over time with art, with sculpture, with architecture, where there were eras of time where the intent behind what was being made was to declare something to the people who engaged with it. And so function, form was over function. And then there became a time where it seemed like it was more function over form, particularly with architecture. And there's not sculpture is not used in the way that it used to be. Sculpture used to be used to adorn the exterior of a building in order to tell you the story of why that building exists. And these days, that's a very rare thing to find that. A sculpture may be used as decoration, but it's not used in the same narrative way that historically it has been.
Yeah, I think that ties perfectly into the next topic that I wanted to talk to you about, which is architecture. We are a far cry from the architecture of something like the Sistine Chapel now. We go to any number of churches, and they look like just kind of warehouse buildings. And I'm interested to hear your perspective of how you think we got from the ornate, beautiful churches that we used to have to the basic buildings that we have now. And I would assume that some of that started maybe with Martin Luther and kind of wanting to get away from the temptation for idolatry that he was speaking out against. And maybe that has informed some of Protestantism and our architecture today. But what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it has. The Protestant Reformation did want to distance themselves from a lot of the iconography of the Roman Church. I think they overcorrected personally. I think as a Protestant pastor in a Presbyterian Reformed context, I'm somebody who much prefers the visual of a Catholic basilica than a Protestant church most of the time. But I think also with that, I think when you start to say we're going to move away from prioritizing the ornate architecture, one of the things that you discover is it's actually a lot cheaper to also build these buildings that don't have a lot of intricacy to them, and it's a lot more cost effective. And then I think it's a combination of, there's some theological reasons why, but I think in the end, especially these days, I think a lot of the reasons why is financial. Is the places where we're building churches are often in areas where the real estate is very expensive. That didn't always used to be the case. Where the ways that you have to build according to city zones and codes is the kind of thing where you can't just hire, stonemasons to come and give 4 years of their lives to stacking one stone on top of another and carving the faces of angels and filigree, into the face of the thing. And so I think we've moved doctrinally, but also economically and also geographically into a place where it would take such a financial commitment to build something like that. I think of the Sagrada de Familia in Barcelona, this church that is still being built, and it's ridiculously ornate and elaborate, and it's this wonder of the world when it comes to architecture. And I don't know if it'll ever be finished, if they'll always just be completely doing it. But it kind of stands alone in that city as the only thing of its kind. I mean, there are other, Barcelona's known for its architecture, and for a few key architects who were responsible for some of these things. But that church, if you go look it up, just look up the cathedral in Barcelona if you want to see a picture of it. You won't believe your eyes. It looks like it's something out of another world. But that city can't support more than one or two of those. No, not many cities can. And so I think that's part of, we sort of painted ourselves, I think, into a little bit of a corner there.
Just thinking about AI, and I don't know how much thought you give into this, but part of the thing that gives me awe when I look at historical works of art, like these big ornate buildings you're talking about, is, thinking of the era they built them in. You're like, how did they do this with no machines, and everything's perfect, and you're like, my goodness, that's incredible. Yeah. With no high tech equipment. But then I look at AI, and it's like the opposite end of that spectrum. Now it's just like, hey, go draw me a perfect masterpiece here, and we'll probably have little computers with paintbrushes and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. So I don't know. What do you see when you see AI and the advent of that as it pertains to art?
I think one of the great temptations in our culture right now is to skip steps. And what we inadvertently lose when we try to do that is we lose craft. We lose the ability to do, the generational ability to do and to teach. What Rembrandt was able to do, Michelangelo was able to do, Van Gogh was able to do. And so personally, for me, I have avoided AI in every way, shape, or form, because I'm a writer, and I don't ever want to not be the one who's writing the words that I use, even if they're not as precise or tight as an AI generator might make a paragraph. I think there's something about, I know that there are ways that people can use AI that are valid. I think there are also ways that we can use AI that are disingenuous and even dishonest. And so I think part of what makes so much of the art that we go visit in museums so powerful is it's made from somebody with a soul. And somebody who has experienced suffering. And AI doesn't know what suffering is, and AI doesn't have a soul. And so technically and even creatively, we can see things that we never would have imagined seeing before, but it's not coming from somebody who's wept. It's not coming from somebody who's buried a loved one. It's not coming from somebody who has been caught in sin and had to repent. And in that sense, my concern is that culturally, we're moving to a place where we're trying to normalize avoiding those parts of the human experience that really are integral to our spiritual growth.
Russ Ramsey, the book is Van Gogh Has a Broken Heart. It'll be out October 22nd. Well, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate your time.
Thank you. This has been great.
All right, everybody, stick with us. We'll be right back with more Faith versus Culture. Welcome back to Faith versus Culture here on the CBN News Channel. I'm here with Dan Andros. Dan, I think that was such an encouraging conversation. I know that it was a little bit different from the topics we normally cover on Faith versus Culture, but I think it's important to talk about these things and talk about how art and the way we engage in culture is a reflection of the gospel. That's because the truth of the gospel is, to an extent, unavoidable.
Yeah. And of course, when you think about just looking around at creation, God's the ultimate artist, right? I mean, I don't know how many times I've said that when I watch a sunset, like, wow, look at that. I mean, God's painting the sky and it's just beautiful. And so we're made in his image, right? And so we are to create too, and we are to express ourselves in that way too. I mean, God didn't have to make the universe so gigantic and incredible, but he did. And, you know, when in a way smaller way, obviously, when we create our art here, it can inspire awe and it can point people to God. And so it's something we definitely shouldn't neglect. You know, art means a lot more than just painting, right?
Yeah, for sure. 100%. Well, everybody stick with us. We'll be right back to wrap up this week's episode of Faith versus Culture. That is all the time we have for this week's episode of Faith versus Culture here on the CBN News Channel. Thank you so much for joining us for that important conversation. If you want more news from a Christian perspective, as always, go over to cbnnews.com and never miss any news of the day. Also, sign up for our Quick Start newsletter, as well as our Quick Start podcast that goes out every weekday morning at 6 a.m., where we go through the news from a gospel perspective. Again, thank you so much for being here, and God bless you.